There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in around midnight, not the peaceful kind, the kind where you are lying in bed, phone face down, ceiling staring back at you, and somewhere in the back of your mind a thought creeps in that you have been trying to outrun since morning. You did everything right today. You answered the emails. You showed up. You smiled when you were supposed to smile. And still, here you are, feeling like something is missing. Not dramatically missing. Not the kind of missing that makes you cry. Just hollow. Like a house where all the furniture is in the right place, but no one actually lives there. If you were born somewhere between 1981 and 1996, there is a good chance you know exactly what that ceiling looks like. This is not a video about generational warfare. This is not about blaming your parents, or blaming the economy, or blaming anyone at all. This is quieter than that. This is about the specific texture of growing up millennial, the particular psychological fingerprints that generation left on you. The invisible weight you carry without even realizing it has a name. So let's sit here for a moment, you and me, let's talk about what actually happened. You grew up in a world that was changing faster than any map could keep up with. When you were a child, the internet arrived not as a convenience but as a revolution, and nobody told you how to survive it. One decade you were playing outside until the streetlights came on. The next decade you were 14 years old, suddenly aware that somewhere online, a version of yourself was being constructed, evaluated, and compared, not by strangers, by everyone you knew. You were the first generation to grow up with a before and an after. Before social media, after it, before 9/11, after it, before the 2008 financial crisis, after it. Each of those befores and afters rewired something in you, quietly, without your permission. And the strange thing is, you adapted. You became incredibly good at adapting, maybe too good. There is a word in psychology called resilience, and for a long time resilience was presented to you as a virtue, a compliment. Look how resilient you are. But here is the part they did not tell you. When you are forced to be resilient too early, when the world around you is unstable and you learn to absorb the instability instead of being protected from it, resilience stops being a gift and starts being a survival mechanism. And survival mechanisms have a cost. I learned how to be okay before I learned how to feel. Think about the way you move through the world, not in big dramatic gestures, but in the small daily rhythms. You check your phone first thing in the morning, not because you want to, but because a part of you needs to know what the temperature of the world is before you decide how to show up in it. You scan for threats before you scan for beauty. You read the room before you enter it. You rehearse conversations in your head, running through possible outcomes the way a chess player runs through possible moves, and sometimes you are so busy rehearsing that by the time you arrive in the actual moment, you are already exhausted. You are probably also deeply, persistently, almost mysteriously tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind of tired that is still there on Monday morning after a full weekend, the kind that makes you wonder sometimes whether you are fundamentally broken or whether everyone secretly feels this way and nobody is saying it out loud. You are driven, and yet you procrastinate. You want connection, and yet you cancel plans. You are ambitious, and yet some mornings the ambition feels like a costume you put on over something much smaller and much more scared. You believe in yourself on Tuesday, and then by Thursday you are Googling signs of imposter syndrome at 11 o'clock at night. That is not inconsistency. That is not weakness. That is something very specific, and it has roots. You grew up in the age of possibility. Every adult around you was telling you that you could be anything, and that message was meant to be liberating. But here is what nobody noticed at the time. When you are told you can be anything, the subtext is, therefore you must become something great. And when you are a child absorbing that message, what you hear is not freedom. What you hear is responsibility, pressure dressed up as permission. Psychologists call this paradox of choice. The researcher Barry Schwartz wrote about how having too many options does not make people happier. It makes them more anxious, more paralyzed, more prone to regret. Because when there are infinite possibilities, every choice you make forecloses 1,000 others. and every path not taken starts to look, over time, like a failure. But with millennials, the paradox of choice was not just about careers or lifestyles. It was baked into identity itself. You were told you could construct who you were. Choose your values, your aesthetics, your community, your spiritual practice, your gender expression, your career trajectory. All of it was supposedly on the table. All of it was supposedly up to you. What a beautiful thing to be told. What a terrifying thing to actually live. Because somewhere underneath all that freedom was a question nobody helped you answer. The question was simply, who are you really when the performance stops? I have been performing competence for so long I forgot it was a performance. This is where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean quietly devastating in a way that takes years to recognize. One of the most consistent psychological patterns in the millennial generation is something researchers call identity foreclosure, combined with chronic self-monitoring. Those are academic terms for something you have felt in your body, probably since your early 20s. Identity foreclosure means you committed to a version of yourself, a role, a personality, a set of achievements, before you had the developmental space to actually explore who you were beneath all that. And chronic self-monitoring means you became so attuned to how others perceive you that the inner voice and the outer performance started to blur together. You were not doing this on purpose. You were responding to a world that evaluated you constantly. Social media did not create this tendency, but it gave it a platform, a metric, a number. Suddenly self-worth had a quantifiable proxy. Likes, followers, engagement, comments. And even if you intellectually knew those numbers were meaningless, your nervous system did not get that memo. Neuroscience tells us that social validation activates the same dopamine pathways as food and physical safety. Your brain, at a very primal level, treats being accepted by your social group as a survival need. So when you post something and then compulsively check for responses, you are not being vain, you are being human. But you are being human inside a system that was specifically designed to exploit that vulnerability, refresh it, monetize it, and send you back for more. The consequence of living inside that system for a decade or more is a particular kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the physical. It is existential. It is the exhaustion of never being quite sure where you end and the performance begins. And it shows up in your relationships in ways you might not have noticed yet. You give more than you have. You say yes when you mean something far more complicated. You anticipate what others need before they ask, because somewhere early in life you learned that tending to other people's emotional weather was safer than sitting inside your own. Therapists sometimes call this fawning, others call it anxious attachment. But before we name it, just notice the pattern. Notice how you can read a room instantly, how you can sense tension before it surfaces, how you are often the one smoothing things over, keeping the peace, translating between people, making sure everyone is comfortable. Notice how rarely you are the one who gets to just be. There is a particular loneliness that lives inside people who are very good at being present for others. It is the loneliness of never being fully received yourself, of giving warmth constantly and wondering, in the quietest corner of your 2 a.m. ceiling staring, whether anyone would stay if you stopped performing the warmth. What would happen if I stopped being useful for a while? And here is the part that cuts deepest. Are you ready? Many millennials spent their childhoods being emotionally parentified without anyone using that word. Parentification does not always look like a child taking on household duties or raising siblings, though sometimes it does. More often it is subtler. It is being the child your parents talk to about their marriage. It is being the one who learned to read the emotional temperature of the house and adjust accordingly. It is learning, before you had language for it, that your job was to regulate the emotional world around you, not to be regulated by it, not to be held, to hold. And you probably did that beautifully. You were probably very, very good at it. And that is the part that breaks my heart a little. Because the skills that made you lovable then, the attunement, the sensitivity, the ability to read others, those same skills became the architecture of your exhaustion. What saved you then is exactly what imprisons you now. You became an expert at other people's emotions, and a stranger to your own. You can describe with precision what someone else is feeling in a room, but ask you what you want, genuinely want, not what you should want, or what makes practical sense, or what would make everyone else comfortable, and the silence that follows is not emptiness. That silence is years of deferred self-knowledge finally surfacing. That silence deserves to be heard. Let's take a breath here for a moment, because that is a heavy thing to sit with, and I do not want to rush past it. The generation that was told they could be anything was also the generation that learned, mostly by experience, that being everything to everyone was the safest way to survive. And those two messages, you can be anything and you must be everything, lived side by side in the same body for decades. And the friction between them is part of what makes millennials so exhausted in such a specific, hard-to-name way. You are not broken, but you are carrying something that was never yours to carry. Now comes the part that is not a fix, because there is no clean fix. And anyone who offers you 1 in 5 steps or 3 morning habits is selling something you do not need. What there is instead is a different kind of looking. Psychologists who work with inner child healing talk about something deceptively simple. They talk about going back, not in time, but in attention. Going back to the part of you that learned to perform in order to belong. The part of you that decided somewhere around age 7 or 11 or 14 that your real feelings were too much or too inconvenient or too unpredictable to be welcome. And that part did not disappear. It went underground. It became the voice that says you are not doing enough. The voice that catastrophizes when someone reads your message and does not reply immediately. The voice that even on the good days keeps one eye on the exit. Shadow work, a concept Carl Jung wrote about long before Instagram made it a buzzword, is simply the practice of turning toward what you have been trained to turn away from, not as punishment, not as a project to complete, but as a form of honesty. The shadows you carry are not character flaws. They are adaptations. They made sense once. The work is not to eliminate them, but to understand them well enough that they stop running the show unconsciously. This might look like noticing the moment you shrink in a conversation and asking, quietly, what that is protecting. It might look like sitting with discomfort for 30 seconds longer than you usually would before reaching for your phone. It might look like writing a single sentence in a journal, not about what you did today, but about what you actually felt, without editing it into something more presentable. You do not have to do this dramatically. You do not have to do it perfectly. In fact, the moment you try to do inner work perfectly, you have already missed the point. Maybe healing is not arriving somewhere. Maybe it is just stopping to pretend you were never lost. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not look like bravery or achievement or resilience. It looks like a person sitting alone at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, doing nothing, just sitting, just breathing, just allowing themselves to exist without agenda for 4 minutes. For someone who has been performing presence their entire adult life, those 4 minutes might be the hardest thing they do all week. You grew up in the most documented generation in human history. Every phase of your life has a digital record somewhere. Your teenage poetry, your college opinions, your early 20s convictions you no longer hold. You have had to watch yourself change in public, revise your beliefs in public, fail in public, and the internet never forgets, which means you have had to develop a very particular relationship with your own past selves. Many millennials carry a quiet shame about who they used to be, not because they did terrible things, but because growth is inherently embarrassing. Because the person you were at 23 was doing their absolute best with what they had, and the person you are now can see all the gaps and blind spots so clearly. And it is easy to cringe. It is easy to want to distance yourself. But developmental psychologists will tell you something that reframes this entirely. The capacity to look back at a former self with discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of integration. It means you grew. The discomfort is the distance between who you were and who you are. And distance means movement. You moved. You kept moving even when you were not sure where you were going, even when the map was wrong, even when the world kept changing the rules. Even when the ground beneath the plan you had for yourself shifted and you had to rebuild. sometimes more than once, without any guarantee that the next version would hold. That is not a small thing. I want you to hear that and actually let it land. Not as a compliment to collect and immediately dismiss, but as a fact. A quiet, verifiable fact. You are still here, you kept going, that counts. The millennial generation is often described by outsiders as entitled or fragile or directionless. And every time that description circulates, it lands somewhere inside you like a small stone, adding to the pile of evidence your inner critic is already curating. But what looks like entitlement from the outside is often something more precise. It is the collision between the expectations you were raised with and the material reality you walked into. It is the friction of being promised a world and then inheriting a different one. The 2008 financial crisis, the student debt, the housing market, the pandemic arriving just as you thought you might finally be finding your footing. That is not fragility. That is a specific sequence of structural pressures on a generation that was developmentally unprepared for them. You were not weak. The conditions were genuinely hard, and the grief of that deserves to be named. Not because naming it changes the conditions, but because unnamed grief has a habit of turning inward, of becoming self-blame, of becoming the voice that says you should be further along by now, should have more by now, should feel better by now. Should is one of the most corrosive words in the English language when it is pointed at yourself. It assumes there is a correct timeline, a right pace, a standard against which your life is being measured. But whose standard? And measured for what? Take a breath here. Slow down for just a moment, because what follows is the thing this whole conversation has been quietly building toward. There is something that begins to shift, often in the late 20s and into the 30s, in the psychology of someone who has spent years performing and adapting and surviving. The shift is not dramatic. It does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives more like a very early morning, before the light is fully up, when the world is still quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing. And in that quiet, a question surfaces that is different from the usual questions. Not what should I do, but what do I actually want? Not how do I fix this, but what am I willing to stop pretending? Not how do I become better, but what would it feel like to be enough, right now exactly as I am? These are not easy questions. They are not comfortable. They do not come with answers attached. But the fact that you are asking them at all means something important. It means the part of you that has been waiting, quietly, underneath all the performance and the productivity and the scanning for threats, that part is still there, still intact, still wondering if it is safe to come out yet. And here is what I want to leave you with. Not a prescription, not a 5-step plan, just an image. Think about the midnight ceiling again, the one from the beginning, the one you have stared at more times than you can count. What if that ceiling was not the symbol of something broken? What if that ceiling was actually the place where, for a few minutes each night, you stop performing? Where the carefully constructed version of yourself goes quiet? Where something truer, something softer, something that does not need to achieve or impress or adapt, just breathes? What if that 2 a.m. quiet was not your failure to be okay? What if it was the most honest moment in your entire day? The millennial generation has been told so many things about who they are. That they are the first digital natives, that they killed the napkin industry and the chain restaurant and the housing market, that they are idealistic to a fault, that they are too online, that they expect too much, that they feel too deeply. Maybe that last one is worth keeping. Maybe the thing that has always been called your weakness is actually the part of you that is most awake. You grew up in a world that changed so fast nobody could build you a reliable map. So you became, out of necessity, your own cartographer. You drew and redrew the territory, often in the dark, often without knowing if the path would hold. And you are still drawing, still revising, still figuring out which parts of the map are accurate and which parts were drawn by fear. That is not a failure of direction. That is what it looks like to stay honest. The generation that was handed a broken promise did something interesting with the breaking. Some of them stopped trusting. Some of them got angry, and that anger was legitimate. Some of them got quiet, and that quiet was survival. But some of them, maybe you, started to ask what was real underneath the promise. started to look not for the world they were told to expect, but for something smaller and more actual, a life that fits, a self that is genuinely theirs, a kind of belonging that does not require performance. That search is not naive. That search is the most serious work a person can do. The ceiling is still there. The questions have not disappeared. The tiredness is real, and it will take longer than a weekend to address. But something else is also true, sitting right alongside all of that. You are more than the adaptation. You are more than the performance. You are more than what you survived. And somewhere underneath the expert reader of rooms, underneath the capable and exhausted and endlessly adapting person you have become, there is still the one who looked at the world at age 9 or 12 or 15 and felt it so fully it almost hurt, who wanted so much, who cared so much, who was, before all the surviving began, simply and completely alive. That one is still there, waiting not to be rescued, just waiting to be remembered.